Today we're going to talk a little bit about the cell and all the different organelles. So this is something we talked about briefly the first day of class when we talked about the difference between a prokaryotic and a eukaryotic organism. But let's just remind ourselves that this is biology, the study of life, so we need to remember that all living organisms are made of cells. And the cell is the simplest collection of matter that can live. So when we talked about the hierarchy of biological organization, we talked about the fact that nothing smaller than a cell can survive on its own. And it's also important to remember, and if you're in lab, you'll talk about microscopes more, but scientists use microscopes to look at all these different organelles or these different parts of the cell we're going to talk about in more detail. And it allows us to see things that we couldn't see with the naked eye. So that's why microscopes are so important. And a type of microscope you'll see around the classroom and that you'll see in lab is known as a light microscope. And that's where you simply pass visible light through some specimen that you might be looking at. And then you can magnify all those internal cellular structures with different types of lenses. So, what were our two main cell types? Well, again, we have prokaryotic cells. And remember, when you think of a prokaryotic cell, you want to think of a simpler, less complex organism. So typically, these cells are smaller. They don't really have a defined nucleus. If you look at the internal structures of a prokaryotic cell, everything just kind of appears to be thrown in there. And a common example of a prokaryotic organism is bacteria. On the other hand, when we talk about eukaryotic cells, these are, I think, probably what people typically think of when they think of a living organism. These are the bigger, kind of prettier organisms, like on the bottom of the page you see flowers or a manatee or mushrooms or something like that. Well, these are larger, more complex animals or organisms that have a defined nucleus that contains DNA. And we're going to talk about the nucleus in just a little bit, and you'll get a better understanding of what a defined nucleus really is. But an example, again, are plants, animals, and different types of fungus. Now, regardless of whether you have a prokaryotic cell or a eukaryotic cell, all cells are going to have some basic features in common, and there's four main basic features I want you to be familiar with. So again, it doesn't matter if you're a bacterial cell, it doesn't matter if you are a human being, you're going to have these characteristics in common with one another. So the first one is all cells are bounded by a plasma membrane. And that basically means you have this membrane that surrounds your cell, and we're going to talk about the plasma membrane a lot, or the biological membrane a lot in future lectures and in the class on down the road. But all cells are going to have this plasma membrane. All cells are also going to contain a semi-fluid substance called cytosol, or you can also refer to it as cytoplasm. And I always like to call it just kind of that stuff that's floating around in the cell, that's surrounding all of our organelles and all of the individual intracellular structures that are found within cells. All cells also contain chromosomes. So you'll get to become pretty familiar with chromosomes and the fact that it is the genetic code for any living organism. Okay, DNA is contained within chromosomes. So understand that all cells have chromosomes. And they also all have these organelles that we call ribosomes. And we'll figure out what those are in just a few minutes. So this is an illustration of a prokaryotic cell. And on the left-hand side, you see kind of a caricature of a prokaryotic cell, whereas on the right-hand side, that's an actual picture taken by some sort of microscope with a camera on it. But you can see that if we're talking about the interior structure of the cell, everything just kind of looks like it's thrown in there. It's not very organized. It's just kind of clumped together, if you will. And I want you to remember that so that when we compare it against the eukaryotic cell, you can kind of visually distinguish the two cell types. So here's our eukaryotic cell, and feel free to, jump back and forth to compare the two, but as you can see, this cell is much more complex. Everything is kind of segregated. It has its own spot and function for every structure that's within the cell. So things aren't just thrown in there. They have a very unique function, but they also have their own kind of location within the cell that allows it to function. And this is another example of a eukaryotic cell. The difference here is that we're talking about a plant cell. So if you compare a eukaryotic animal cell, which was the picture we saw before, with this eukaryotic plant cell, I think one of the first things you'll notice is that the animal cell typically has kind of an oval or circular appearance, and this plant cell has more of a cubed slash kind of square shape. And that's because of the fact that plant cells have something called a cell wall that surrounds it, and it gives it that kind of square or rectangular shape.